There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We dragged them into the light. Welcome to Gravevale Echoes. Mr. Dillett, a collector of rare treasures, believed he had found the perfect antique, a beautiful miniature house from another era. But this is no mere toy. It is a cursed stage where a family's horrible history plays out on a loop, forever seeking a new audience. Mr. Julius Dillett was a man defined by his possessions. He was not a creature of grand passions or volatile emotions. His heart beat to the quiet, steady rhythm of acquisition. To others, he might have seemed a dry, uninteresting bachelor, a man who had replaced human connection with the cold company of antiques. But in his own world, the world of dusty auction houses, obscure catalogs, and the thrill of the hunt, he was a king. His life was a carefully curated collection, each piece a testament to his discerning eye and his patient, predatory nature. He lived for the moment when a rare, forgotten treasure would emerge from the clutter of the mundane, and he would feel that familiar, possessive thrill, a cold, sharp spike of desire that was more potent to him than any romance. It was the desire not just to see but to own, to possess, to make a piece of the past his and his alone. His quest had led him, on a dreary Tuesday afternoon, to a lesser-known auction house tucked away in a drab, unremarkable part of the city. It was the kind of place most serious collectors would overlook, filled mostly with the unremarkable estates of the recently deceased. But Mr. Dillett knew that sometimes, the most magnificent pearls were found in the plainest of oysters. He sat on a hard wooden chair, feigning a bored indifference as lot after lot of silverware, second-rate paintings, and faded furniture was presented and sold. He waited. Patience was his greatest weapon. And then it appeared. It was wheeled out onto the stage by two straining attendants, and a collective quiet gasp went through the small crowd. It was a doll's house, but to call it a doll's house was like calling a cathedral a shed. It was a masterpiece, a breathtaking work of architectural art in miniature. It stood nearly 4 feet high, a perfect, exquisite replica of a grand house from the early 19th century, its facade crafted with a precision that was almost unnerving. The tiny red bricks were individually laid, the slate tiles on the roof were perfectly staggered, and the sash windows, complete with delicate paper-thin panes of real glass, were flawlessly constructed. It was a marvel of obsessive detail. A strange hush fell over the room as the auctioneer began his description. The house, he explained, was a unique piece, the origin of which was somewhat mysterious, having come from a reclusive estate. It was known simply as the Blackett House, after the family who had owned it last. As he spoke, Mr. Dillett's professional calm began to evaporate, replaced by that familiar, cold fire of obsession. He wasn't just looking at a well-made antique. He felt an almost magnetic pull towards it, a deep, instinctual need that bypassed all reason. He saw the intricate details, the tiny brass knocker on the front door, the miniature urns flanking the steps, the delicate ironwork on the balconies. It was perfect, utterly, hauntingly perfect. He had to have it. The bidding was surprisingly sluggish at first. A few half-hearted offers were made, but the piece was too large, too strange, too specific for most tastes. It was not a practical or easily displayed item. But for Dillett, its grand, awkward size was part of its allure. This was a statement piece, a monument. He let the amateur bidders tire themselves out, and then, with the calm, predatory grace of a shark, he entered the fray. His bids were quiet but firm, each one delivered with an air of finality that discouraged competition. In the end, there was only one other serious contender, a dealer he recognized from across the room. Their eyes met for a moment in a silent declaration of war. The price climbed higher and higher, far beyond what a mere toy should ever command. But Dillett would not be denied. With a final, decisive bid that made the auctioneer raise his eyebrows, the hammer fell. "Sold," the auctioneer declared. To the gentleman in the 4th row, a wave of triumph, cold and satisfying, washed over Mr. Dillett. He had won. He had secured his prize. As he arranged for its transport, he felt a giddiness that was almost unseemly. He couldn't wait to get it home, to install it in his study, to spend the evening poring over every single perfect detail. The doll's house was more than just his latest acquisition. He felt, in a strange way, that it was the culmination of his life's work as a collector. It was the crown jewel. The journey home and the careful installation of the house in his study took the rest of the day. His study was his sanctuary, a room lined with glass-fronted cabinets filled with rare books, ancient coins, and other carefully chosen artifacts. It was a silent, ordered world, and the doll's house, placed in the center of the room, immediately became its heart. As evening fell, casting long shadows across the floor, Dillett lit a fire in the hearth and settled into his favorite leather armchair. A glass of sherry in hand, to finally admire his new treasure in peace. The house was even more magnificent up close. The entire front facade was hinged, swinging open like a giant set of double doors to reveal the 4 main rooms inside, each one furnished with a staggering, almost insane level of detail. There was a parlor, a dining room, a bedroom, and a kitchen, all populated with tiny, rigid doll figures with painted-on faces and stiff, formal clothing. The furniture was a perfect replica of the period, from tiny, hand-carved chairs to a miniature grand piano with keys that actually depressed when touched. It was a self-contained world, a moment of the past frozen in time. He spent over an hour just marveling at the craftsmanship, his collector's heart swelling with pride. It was during this quiet contemplation that he felt his first flicker of unease. He had a cousin, a man he found particularly irritating, who was a student of architectural history. On a whim, Dillett had written him a short letter earlier in the day, gloating about his purchase and describing the doll's house in meticulous detail, hoping to make the man jealous. Just as he was beginning to nod off by the fire, a reply came, delivered by a late-night messenger. His cousin's response was not one of jealousy. It was one of alarm. Dillett tore open the envelope, a frown creasing his brow. The letter was short and to the point. His cousin recognized the description immediately. "You must be mistaken," the letter read. "There can't be 2 houses like that. The house you describe is not a fantasy. It is, without a doubt, a perfect scale model of a real place. A rather infamous one, in fact. It was known as Lawford Hall, and it was the ancestral home of the Golightly family." Dillett's blood ran cold. The Golightly family. He knew the name. Everyone in the region knew the name. They were a family spoken of only in whispers, a clan whose history was a dark and tangled tapestry of scandal, madness, and unexplained tragedies. The family had died out generations ago, their line ending in a series of grim, closely timed deaths that had become the stuff of local ghost stories. They were said to have been cursed, doomed by the sins of their ancestors. Lawford Hall, the real house, had burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances nearly a century ago, as if the very land were trying to purge itself of their memory. He stood up and walked back to the doll's house, his sense of triumph now curdled by a creeping dread. He stared at it, but he no longer saw a beautiful, inanimate object. He saw a miniature tomb, a stage for a forgotten tragedy. This wasn't just a replica of a house. It was a replica of that house, the home of the cursed Golightleys. The name the auctioneer had given the Blackett house must have been from a later owner, a name used to mask its true, sinister identity. Who would build such a thing, and why? Was it a tribute, a warning, or something else entirely? The fire in the hearth crackled, and the shadows danced within the tiny, silent rooms of the house. He peered closer, his face inches from the miniature parlor. The dolls stood frozen in their polite, static poses, their painted smiles seeming to mock him. But a chill, completely unrelated to the draft in the old room, snaked its way down his spine. He was no longer just a collector admiring a rare find. He was the owner of a relic tied to a dark and violent history. He had brought the home of the Golightleys into his own sanctuary. And as he stared into the tiny, shadowed rooms, a new, terrible thought began to form in his mind. Perhaps he hadn't just brought home the house. Perhaps he had brought home its inhabitants, too. The revelation that his prized doll's house was a replica of the infamous Lawford Hall, home of the cursed Golightly family, had irrevocably tainted Mr. Dillett's triumph. The initial thrill of ownership had soured into a strange and unsettling apprehension. He tried to dismiss it, to tell himself that it was merely a historical curiosity, an interesting but ultimately meaningless detail. The house was still a magnificent work of art, and its grim history only added to its value as a unique artifact. But as he prepared for bed that night, leaving the doll's house standing silent and imposing in the center of his study, he couldn't shake a deep, prickling sense of unease. He felt as if a dark story had followed him home, and its first chapter was about to be written in his own house. His study was his sanctuary, the one place in the world where he felt completely in control. It was a room of quiet, ordered solitude. The walls were lined with towering bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes, their spines forming a neat, unbroken wall of brown and gold. His collection of Roman coins was displayed in shallow, velvet-lined drawers. A row of prehistoric fossils sat on a high shelf. Every object was catalogued, dusted, and placed with meticulous care. It was a museum of his own making, a fortress against the messy, unpredictable outside world. And now, in the very heart of this ordered kingdom, sat the doll's house. It dominated the room. Even in the dim light of the dying fire, its presence was immense. It was more than just a piece of furniture. It was an entity. Its tiny windows seemed to absorb the shadows, making the interior spaces look like pools of impenetrable blackness. The doll figures within, all 7 of them, stood frozen in their designated places. A man and a woman in the parlor, another woman in the dining room, a maid in the kitchen, and upstairs, an elderly couple and a young child, each in separate bedrooms. They were just dull, stiff, primitive figures made of wood and plaster, with crude, painted-on expressions. Yet, in the heavy silence of the study, they seemed to possess a latent, watchful quality. As Dillet finally turned to leave the room for the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched by 14 tiny, painted eyes. He slept poorly, his dreams troubled by vague, unsettling images of dark hallways and whispering voices. The following evening, he found himself drawn back to the study, compelled by a mixture of fascination and dread. He settled into his armchair, intending to read, but his eyes kept drifting over the top of his book to the doll's house. The fire in the hearth crackled and hissed, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. The light danced on the miniature facade, glinting off the tiny glass panes of the windows, making them shimmer and sparkle. It was during one of these moments, as his eyes roamed over the front of the house, that he saw it. Or rather, he thought he saw it. For the briefest of moments, inside the tiny, upstairs bedroom on the left, he thought he saw one of the doll figures, the one representing the old woman, move. It was not a dramatic movement, just a slight, jerky turn of the head, as if it were looking towards the door. He blinked, his heart giving a sudden, sharp jolt. He stared intently at the spot, holding his breath, but the figure was perfectly still, exactly as it had been before. He let out a slow breath, a faint, nervous laugh escaping his lips. It was a trick of the light. Of course it was. The firelight, flickering and unstable, was playing games with his eyes, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. The play of light and shadow on the curved, painted surface of the doll's head was all it took. He was letting the grim history of the house get the better of him, allowing his imagination to run wild. He was a rational man, a man of logic and learning. He was not one to be spooked by shadows. He forced his attention back to his book, determined to ignore the unsettling object that was becoming the room's oppressive centerpiece. But the seed of doubt had been planted. He found he could no longer concentrate on the printed words. The text blurred before his eyes. His senses were on high alert, every nerve ending attuned to the silent house across the room. He sat there for what felt like an hour, pretending to read, but all the while he was listening, watching from the corner of his eye. The house remained silent. The dolls remained motionless. The sense of unease began to slowly subside, and he started to feel foolish for his momentary panic. He eventually grew tired and decided to retire for the night. He stood up, stretched, and took one final look at the doll's house before leaving the study. And that is when the blood in his veins turned to ice. It was not a trick of the light this time. It was an undeniable, terrifying fact. The dolls had moved. They were no longer in their original, polite positions. The entire scene within the house had been rearranged into a new, disturbing tableau. His mind struggled to accept what his eyes were seeing. In the parlor on the ground floor, where the man and woman had been standing apart, they were now close together, their stiff bodies angled towards each other as if in the middle of a heated, silent argument. The woman's head was tilted back, her painted smile looking more like a grimace of anger. In the dining room, the solitary female figure had been moved from the center of the room to the window, her back to the interior, as if staring out into the darkness of Dillet's study. But the most chilling change was upstairs. In the left bedroom, the figure of the old woman, the one he thought he'd seen move, was now lying flat in her tiny, four-poster bed. Her pose was unnaturally stiff, and a tiny piece of white linen, like a miniature bedsheet, had been pulled up to her chin. In the other bedroom, the figure of the old man was no longer in his room at all. He had been moved. He was now standing in the hallway, a dark, rigid figure positioned just outside the old woman's closed bedroom door. His painted face, with its neutral expression, now seemed to Dillet to be one of grim, malevolent intent. He looked like he was listening, waiting. Dillet stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. This was impossible. Who could have done this? He was the only one in the house. The servants had all gone to bed hours ago. No one had entered the study. He was absolutely terrifyingly certain of that. He took a hesitant step closer, peering into the miniature world that had become so menacing. The scene was charged with a silent, malevolent energy. It was no longer a collection of toys. It was a snapshot of a moment, a frozen play filled with sickness, anger, and dread. The house was telling him a story, and it was a story he did not want to hear. A wild, panic thought seized him. He had to be sure. He had to prove to himself that he wasn't going mad. With a trembling hand, He reached into the house. His large, clumsy fingers felt monstrous and out of place in the tiny, perfect rooms. Carefully, painstakingly, he moved each doll back to its original position. He placed the man and woman apart in the parlor. He moved the other woman back to the center of the dining room. He stood the old woman back up by her bed and placed the old man back in his own room, across the hall. He made sure every detail was exactly as it had been when he first opened the house. His hands shook so badly that he nearly knocked over a tiny table. When he was finished, he backed away from the house, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow and rapid. He didn't sleep in his bedroom that night. He spent the long, dark hours in his armchair, his gaze fixed on the doll's house, waiting. Nothing happened. The dolls remained exactly where he had put them. The next morning, the bright light of day did little to dispel the horror. It only made it more real, more stark. He left the house, needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere of his study. He spent the day trying to distract himself, but the image of the rearranged dolls was burned into his mind. When he finally returned home that evening, he went straight to the study, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He threw open the door and strode to the center of the room, his heart pounding. He stared into the doll's house, and a wave of nausea and terror washed over him. It had happened again. The dolls were back in the disturbed positions from the night before. The argument in the parlor, the woman at the window, and upstairs, the sick woman in her bed, with the old man standing sentinel outside her door. But it wasn't just that they had moved back to the disturbing tableau. It was more horrifying than that. They had been reset first. His frantic repositioning from the night before had been completely undone. He understood now. It wasn't a one-time event. It was a cycle. Something was happening here. Some unseen hand, some ghostly stage manager, was ensuring that the scene was perfectly set every single day, waiting for the curtain to rise on its grim, silent performance. The dolls were not just being moved. They were being reset, as if they were actors being put back on their marks, ready to play out their terrible, predestined roles all over again. The house wasn't just haunted. It was cursed to repeat a story. And Mr. Dillett, the new owner, was its captive audience. The discovery that the dolls were not just moving, but actively resetting themselves each day, shattered the last of Mr. Dillett's skepticism. The doll's house was no longer a beautiful, if unsettling, artifact. It was a theater of the damned, and he was its sole, unwilling patron. The rational part of his mind, the part that dealt in facts and figures and the solid, tangible reality of his collections, was screaming that this was impossible. But the evidence was right there, sitting in the center of his study, a silent miniature mockery of all the laws of nature. He was trapped in a state of horrified fascination, repulsed by what he was witnessing, yet utterly unable to look away. He knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had to see it through. He had to know what happened next in this dreadful, silent play. That night, he did not even attempt to read. He sat in his leather armchair, the book lying forgotten on the floor beside him, and simply watched. The study was dark except for the low, glowing embers of the fire and a single, tall candle he had placed on the mantelpiece. Its flame cast long, dancing shadows that made the room feel vast and alive. He stared at the doll's house, his eyes straining in the gloom, his senses stretched to a painful point of tension. He was waiting. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but he felt that some signal, some cue, was imminent. The house was a coiled spring, and the air around it was thick with a tense, expectant energy. And then it came. It was a sound so faint, so delicate, that at first he thought he had imagined it. Tiny, thin, metallic tinkling. It was a high-pitched, silvery note, like a single grain of sand striking a tiny pane of glass. It came again, a fragile ting that was almost lost in the soft hiss of the fire. Dillett sat bolt upright, his entire body rigid. The sound was coming from the doll's house. He strained to hear, his head cocked, his breathing shallow. Ting, ting. It was the sound of a bell, a miniature bell, being rung with a frantic, insistent rhythm from somewhere deep inside the haunted toy. It was the sound of a servant being summoned, or perhaps an alarm being raised. In the dead silence of the study, the tiny, tinny sound was as jarring as a thunderclap. It was the signal. The play was beginning. He wanted to run. He wanted to throw a sheet over the cursed thing, to lock the study door and never return. But he was paralyzed, held in his chair by a force more powerful than his fear. His morbid curiosity. He had to see. Leaning forward, his heart hammering against his ribs, he peered into the dimly lit interior of the house. The scene was as it had been earlier, the argument in the parlor, the sick woman in the bed, the man listening in the hall. For a long moment, nothing happened. The bell continued its frantic, tiny ringing, a sound that was quickly beginning to grate on his nerves, filling him with a sense of escalating panic. Then he saw movement. It was the figure of the old man in the upstairs hallway. With a slow, unnatural smoothness that made the hairs on the back of Dillet's neck stand on end, the doll figure turned. It glided across the miniature landing, a movement devoid of any human jerkiness, as if it were being pulled by an invisible string. It stopped outside the sick woman's bedroom door. The tiny bell inside the room suddenly went silent. The abrupt absence of the sound was more shocking than the sound itself. A heavy, dreadful silence fell over the house. Dillet held his breath, his eyes glued to the scene. The figure of the old man raised a stiff, wooden arm and seemed to push open the bedroom door. It slid into the room, a dark, rigid shape moving towards the four-poster bed where the figure of the old woman lay. Dillet's mind reeled. He was watching a premeditated act unfold. The scene was no longer static. It was a narrative, a story of malice progressing step by horrifying step. He watched, mesmerized, as the male doll reached the bedside. It stood there for a long, terrible moment, looming over the prone figure in the bed. A sudden log in the fireplace broke apart, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. The sudden flare of light illuminated the doll's house with a brilliant, momentary flash. Dillet flinched. When his eyes refocused on the scene a second later, the tableau had changed once more, and a strangled cry caught in his throat. The figure of the old man was no longer standing by the bed. It was now positioned near the door, its back to the room as if about to leave. And the figure of the old woman, she was no longer in the bed. She was lying on the floor. Her tiny, stiff body was sprawled in a broken, unnatural angle beside the bed, as if she had been thrown there with great force. One of her arms was twisted beneath her, and her head was bent at an impossible angle. There was no mistaking the meaning of the scene. It was a moment of shocking, brutal violence. Dillet felt a wave of cold nausea wash over him. He had just witnessed a murder, a silent, ghostly reenactment of a killing that had happened a century ago. The sick woman hadn't just died of her illness. She had been killed, in her own bed, by her own husband. The tiny, tinkling bell had been her last, desperate cry for help, a cry that had gone unanswered. The horror of it was absolute. He was a voyeur to a historical crime, a crime that was doomed to be repeated, night after night, in this miniature prison. He wanted to look away, to break the spell, but he couldn't. He was a prisoner of the unfolding horror. He felt that the worst must surely be over. But he was wrong. The play was not finished. A new, even more grotesque act was about to begin. As he stared, transfixed by the grim scene in the bedroom, he saw movement on the floor below. The figures in the parlor, the ones who had been arguing, were now moving. They glided from the parlor into the main hallway of the doll's house. They were joined by the woman from the dining room. The three figures gathered at the bottom of the main staircase, their painted faces turned upwards, as if they were listening, waiting for a signal from the floor above. And then the signal came. The figure of the old man, the murderer, emerged from the bedroom. He moved to the top of the stairs. He seemed to pause there, looking down at the three figures below. Then, with that same unervingly smooth motion, he descended. The four figures convened in the hall, a silent, grim-faced gathering. They stood there for a moment, and then, as one, they turned and moved towards the back of the house, disappearing into the shadowed recesses of the miniature kitchen. Dillet was trembling, his mind struggling to process the grotesque pantomime. What were they doing? What came next? The answer was more horrifying than anything he could have possibly imagined. After a few agonizing minutes of stillness, two of the figures, the man from the parlor and the murderer himself, emerged from the kitchen. And they were carrying something between them. It was a box, a small, oblong box, made of a dark, polished wood. It was long and narrow, and wider at one end than the other. Dillet's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. It was a coffin, perfect, miniature, child's coffin. The sight was so monstrous, so deeply wrong, that Dillet felt a physical revulsion. His stomach churned. A child's coffin. The implications were sickening. He watched, frozen in a state of nauseated horror, as the two male figures carried the tiny coffin with a dreadful, solemn slowness. They carried it up the grand staircase. They bypassed the murder scene in the master bedroom and continued down the hall. They stopped outside the last door, the one belonging to the room where the doll of the small child had been placed. They pushed the door open and entered. The doll of the child was sitting up in its tiny bed, a small, innocent figure in a white nightgown. The two male dolls walked to the bedside. They placed the tiny, dark coffin directly on top of the bed, right beside the seated child. And there they stopped. The scene was now set for its final, ghastly tableau. The murdered grandmother on the floor in one room, and a small empty coffin laid out in another, a silent, terrible promise of the next victim. It was in that moment that the full, crushing weight of the truth descended upon Mr. Dillett. He finally understood. He wasn't just watching a random haunting. He was watching the methodical, ritualistic unfolding of the Golightly family's doom. This wasn't just about one murder. It was a generational curse, a repeating cycle of evil that consumed the entire family, one by one. It began with malice and sickness, escalated to murder, and culminated in the death of the innocent, the death of the children. This was the family's legacy. Not wealth or property, but a self-perpetuating cycle of death that played out within the walls of their home. And this doll's house, this cursed artifact, was not just a model. It was a vessel that contained the echo of their entire tragedy, forcing it to play out, again and again, for all eternity. And he, Mr. Julius Dillett, was its new keeper. The final, grotesque tableau inside the doll's house held Mr. Dillett in a state of paralyzed horror. The sight of the miniature coffin, a dark, polished promise of death laid beside the innocent figure of the child, was an image of such profound malevolence that it seemed to suck all the warmth and reason from the world. He was no longer just an observer watching a distant, historical tragedy. The horror felt immediate, personal, and deeply contaminating. He felt as if he had breathed in something toxic, a spiritual poison that was now spreading through his own soul. He sat rigid in his chair, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles were white, his eyes locked on the cursed scene. It was then that he felt the cold. It did not creep in slowly from the edges of the room. It descended upon him all at once, a sudden, shocking plunge in temperature that was as tangible as a physical blow. The cheerful, roaring fire he had built in the hearth, which had been his only source of comfort and light, seemed to falter in an instant. The lively, crackling flames withered, shrinking back from the edges of the grate. They sputtered and hissed, their bright orange and yellow hues dimming to a weak, sickly blue. The warmth it had been throwing into the room vanished, replaced by a damp, penetrating chill that felt like it was emanating from the very stones of the house. It was a deep, unnatural cold, the kind of cold that is associated not with winter, but with crypts and tombs. A cold that felt ancient and full of sorrow. Dillett shivered violently, a tremor that had nothing to do with the room's temperature and everything to do with the sudden, primal fear that gripped him. The air grew heavy and thick, pressing in on him, and the silence in the room became absolute. Because the bell had stopped, the faint, tinkling sound from the doll's house, which had served as the dreadful score for the ghostly play, had abruptly ceased. The performance was over, or perhaps it had been interrupted. The sudden, profound silence was, in its own way, more terrifying than the sound it replaced. While the bell had been ringing, the horror had been contained within the miniature world of the doll's house. It was a show, a performance on a tiny stage. But now, with the silence, the boundaries seemed to dissolve. The silence felt like a held breath. It felt like the moment after a predator has spotted its prey, the instant before the pounce. The focus of the horror was shifting. It was no longer confined to the house. It was expanding, leaking out into the study, into his world. Dillett's gaze, which had been fixed on the child's coffin, was suddenly pulled away. He felt it again, that same terrifying sensation he'd had the night before, the feeling of being watched. But this time it was 1,000 times more powerful. It was not a vague sense of unease. It was a focused, piercing, malevolent stare. And it wasn't coming from the doll's house. It was coming from somewhere behind him, from the darkest corner of the study. His heart felt like it was going to hammer its way out of his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to stay perfectly still, to not turn around, to not acknowledge the presence that now shared the room with him. To look would be to confirm a truth his mind was not prepared to handle. He sat there, frozen, for what felt like a lifetime, the icy cold seeping deeper into his bones, the oppressive silence ringing in his ears. But the feeling of the stare was too intense, too insistent. It bored into the back of his head, a physical pressure that was impossible to ignore. Finally, with a slow, jerky movement that felt like it was tearing his own muscles, he turned his head. The corner of the study, the one farthest from the fire and the candle, had always been a place of deep shadow. Now it was a pool of absolute, impenetrable blackness, a darkness so profound it seemed to be a solid thing. And from the heart of that solid darkness, a shape was beginning to form. It was not a doll. It started as a faint, shimmering distortion in the air, a patch of silvery gray mist coalescing against the black. It was translucent, ethereal, like smoke slowly taking on a human form. It grew taller, more defined, the vague outline of a head and shoulders becoming clearer with each passing, heart-stopping second. Dillett watched, a strangled, whimpering sound caught in his throat, as the mist solidified. It was resolving itself into the figure of a child. It was life-sized, or rather, the size a child would be. It was pale, almost luminous, with a ghostly light that seemed to come from within. It wore a simple, old-fashioned white nightgown, just like the doll in the upstairs bedroom. Its feet were bare, hovering an inch or two above the floorboards, not quite touching the mortal world. Its face was a pale, tragic oval, its features indistinct at first, but its eyes were two dark, hollow pits. They were voids of shadow, yet Dillet could feel their gaze on him as surely as if they were solid things. They were ancient eyes, filled with a sorrow so deep and a rage so cold that it seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. This was no trick of the light. This was not a fever dream. This was a ghost, a spectral child, torn from its grave and now standing in his study, 10 feet away from him. The terror that seized Mr. Dillet was unlike anything he had ever known. It was a pure, primal, mind-shattering horror that bypassed all thought and reason. It was the fear of a rational man confronted with the absolute, undeniable proof of the irrational. The world he knew, the world of order and logic and collectible artifacts, had been torn apart, and this terrible, sorrowful apparition was its new, horrifying reality. He wanted to scream, but his throat was paralyzed. He wanted to run, but his limbs were locked in place, as if bound by invisible chains. All he could do was stare, his mind blank with a terror too profound for words. And then the ghost child moved. It raised an arm. The movement was agonizingly slow, as if the very act required a monumental effort, dragging against the weight of a century of grief. The arm was thin, translucent, the bones faintly visible through the ghostly flesh. The hand at the end of it was small and pale. The arm rose higher and higher, until it was pointing, its small, trembling index finger extended. And it was pointing directly at him. The accusation was silent, yet it screamed in Dillet's mind. The hollow eyes of the specter were locked on his, and the trembling finger was a spear of cold fire aimed at his heart. He felt a wave of cold dread so intense it made him dizzy. Why him? He was just a collector, an innocent bystander who had bought a piece of furniture. But as he looked into those bottomless pits of sorrow and rage, he understood. To the ghost, there was no such thing as an innocent bystander. To watch the tragedy was to become a part of it. To own the house was to own the curse. A low, mournful sound filled the room. It was a sound of profound grief, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all the world's sorrows. It came from the ghost child. And then, with that same dreadful slowness, the child's pointing finger moved. It shifted its aim. The finger moved from Mr. Dillet, traveled through the air in a slow, deliberate arc and came to a stop, now pointing directly at the doll's house. The meaning of the gesture was terrifyingly, brutally clear. It was a transfer, a passing of the torch. It was a silent declaration that said, "You saw what happened to me. You saw my doom. I was the audience for their evil, and then I was the victim. Now you are the audience." The gesture linked him irrevocably to the cursed object and to the tragedy it contained. He was no longer just the owner. He was the next participant. The pointing finger was not just an accusation. It was a sentence. It was the physical embodiment of the curse, reaching out across the decades to claim its next soul. The ghostly child, a victim itself, had become the herald of the doom, tasked with anointing the next in line. And it had just chosen Mr. Julius Dillet. The spectral finger of the child remained pointing at the doll's house, a silent, damning indictment that hung in the frozen air of the study. For Mr. Dillet, that simple, terrible gesture shattered the world. In that moment, he was no longer Mr. Julius Dillet, esteemed collector, man of reason, and master of his own ordered domain. That man had ceased to exist. In his place was a trembling, terrified creature who had been stripped of all his comforting illusions. The invisible wall that had separated him from the horrors of the past, the safe distance between the observer and the observed, had been utterly annihilated. He was not watching a story. He was now a character in it. A new name added to the cast list of a tragedy that had been running for over a century. He had spent his life collecting objects, believing he was their master. He saw them as beautiful, silent, and, most importantly, dead. They were pieces of a past he could own, control, and display on his own terms. But he had been wrong. He had operated under the foolish assumption that the past stays dead. He now understood, with a clarity that was a new and exquisite form of torture, that the past is not dead at all. It isn't even past. It is a hungry, living thing that lies in wait within the objects it once touched. And sometimes, when a new owner comes along, it decides to wake up. He had reached out to possess an artifact, and in return, its history, its curse, had reached out and possessed him. The silent accusation held for a moment longer, the ghost child and its pointing finger locking Dillet into a terrifying trinity with the doll's house. Then, just as it had formed, the apparition began to dissolve. The process was a slow, sorrowful fading. The sharp outlines of the child's form softened and blurred. The ghostly light that emanated from within it seemed to dim, its pale luminescence receding. The figure became translucent again, a shimmering wisp of sorrow and memory. The hollow, accusing eyes melted back into shadow. The last thing to vanish was the pointing hand, which seemed to hang in the air for a fraction of a second longer before it too was gone, fading into nothingness as if it had never been. The ghost child was gone, but its presence remained. The profound, unnatural cold still clung to the room, a damp, grave-like chill that the now-dead fire in the hearth could not combat. The silence it left behind was heavier, more profound than before. It was a silence filled with the weight of what had just happened, a silence that rang with unspoken threats and unanswered questions. Mr. Dillet remained frozen in his chair, his body rigid, his mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. He slowly, hesitantly, lowered his gaze from the empty corner where the ghost had been and looked back at the doll's house. He sat there, silent and waiting. The grotesque tableau inside was unchanged. The murdered woman on the floor, the tiny coffin on the child's bed. But the object itself looked different to him now. It was no longer a masterpiece of craftsmanship or a rare antique. It was a cancer, a malignant growth in the heart of his home. It was a gateway to a place of horror he never knew existed, and the ghost child had just shoved him through it. He felt a violent, visceral urge to destroy it. He imagined taking the poker from the fireplace and smashing the delicate facade to pieces, splintering the tiny furniture, and grinding the cursed doll figures into dust. He imagined taking the wreckage outside and burning it until nothing was left but a pile of unrecognizable ash. But he knew, with a dreadful, intuitive certainty, that it would do no good. The curse was not in the wood and plaster. The curse was not in the dolls. Those were just the vessel, the stage. The curse was an idea, a memory, a lingering stain of evil, and he now understood that it had found a new vessel, him. Destroying the doll's house would be like a man trying to cure a plague by burning a single blanket from a sickbed. It was too late. The infection had already spread. He was the new owner, not just of the house, but of the Golightly doom. The curse had been passed down, and he was its newest, unwilling heir. With an effort that felt like it took all the remaining strength in his body, he pushed himself up from the chair. His legs were weak and trembling, and he had to grip the back of the chair to steady himself. He took a stumbling step, then another, moving not towards the doll's house, but away from it, backing towards the study door as if retreating from a wild animal. He couldn't bear to be in the same room with it for a second longer. His sanctuary had become his prison cell, and that house was his warden. He fumbled with the doorknob, his hand shaking too badly to get a proper grip. Finally, the latch clicked, and he practically fell out of the room, slamming the heavy oak door shut behind him. He stood in the dark, cold hallway of his own home, panting, his back pressed against the door, as if to physically hold back the horror he had just left inside. But there was no escape. He knew that when he opened that door in the morning, the house would still be there. And he knew, with a certainty that made his blood run cold, that the dolls would have been reset. They would be back in their original, polite starting positions, ready for the play to begin all over again. For him, the night that followed was a living hell. He did not go to his bed. He couldn't bear the thought of being alone in the dark with his own thoughts. He spent the remaining hours until dawn in the downstairs drawing room, sitting in the dark, a candelabra of unlit candles on the table before him. He just sat, staring into the blackness, replaying the events of the evening over and over in his mind. The tinkling bell, the murder, the tiny coffin, and most of all, the pale, sorrowful face of the ghost child and its accusing, trembling finger. What did it mean to be the heir to the curse? Would he be forced to watch the grim pantomime every single night for the rest of his life? A slow descent into madness? Or was it something worse? The Golightly family had not just been observers of their own doom. They had been active participants. Their evil had been turned inward, consuming them from within. Was that his fate? Would the violence he had witnessed begin to seep into his own soul? Would he start to feel the rage of the murderer, the despair of the victim, the terror of the child? Would he become one of them? As the first weak gray light of dawn began to filter through the windows, a new, horrifying thought occurred to him, a question that was perhaps the most terrible of all. The play he had witnessed had ended with a coffin being brought to a child's room. It was an unfinished story, a promise of a death yet to come. Was the curse waiting for him to play a part? Was it waiting for him to provide the final act? The doll's house was a replica of Lawford Hall. The dolls were replicas of the Golightleys. Was he, Julius Dillett, now the stand-in for some other historical figure he didn't know about? Perhaps the final person to witness the tragedy before the family died out? Or worse, the one responsible for the final death? He didn't know. He was adrift in a sea of terrifying possibilities. The only thing he knew for certain was that his life as a quiet, detached collector was over. He had bought a piece of history, and now that history was going to unmake him. The doom of the Golightly family had found a new home. It sat waiting for him, silent and patient, in his study. He was its keeper now, its audience, and he feared its next and perhaps final victim. The beautiful doll's house was no longer his prized possession. It was his inheritance. It was his tombstone. The beautiful doll's house sits waiting. Its terrible play paused for now. Mr. Dillett thought he was buying a piece of history, but he has inherited a curse. The doom of the Golightly family has found a new home and a new soul to haunt. What do you think will happen to Mr. Dillett now that he is part of the curse? And what fate awaits a man haunted by a child's ghost? Let me know what you think in the comments. The final page is turned, but the chill will linger long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe and return for the next secret we unearth.